This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
So, did you know, actually, that all that lies between you and Christmas Eve is 3 measly weekends? Did you know that? Did you care? Yeah, nobody cares. Like 3 weeks from tomorrow is Christmas Eve, which means 3 weeks from today, 6 o'clock, we'll be gathering for our first Christmas Eve worship gathering. Nothing that morning. Did you put your Christmas tree up yet? Anybody? Christmas trees? Real Christmas trees? Anybody? I find it so hilarious that people in Helena, Montana have false Christmas trees. It's so weird. Like you can cut them out of your backyard. Anyway, we put ours up on Sunday afternoon, evening-ish with some friends. Actually, the first tree we saw would have worked, but we had to go get stuck first, and then after we were stuck, that somehow justified getting the first tree that we saw. That's its own story. But as a result of having our Christmas tree up, of course, our youngest, Justice, who's in kindergarten, spent the rest of the evening, and I don't know how many times the next couple of days he would just say to me, I can't wait till Christmas. Can't wait till Christmas. Typically, or usually, he had one of his gifts clutched in his hands. I can't wait till Christmas. Which is so disappointing because we were all proud, we thought of this present we were going to get him that he wanted to buy, and we got up to the check stand at Target, and it was, this isn't a joke, he thought it was $7 and it was $50. We let him down there in terms of navigating those price tags. So then we went back and got it for him for Christmas, and we were so excited, and then Teresa wrapped it, and he picked it up, and he's like, oh, I know what this is. It's a square box with a rounded top. Oh, these are those action figures from Avengers. I know exactly. No, it's not. It's Barbies. This is the action figures. So we walked around saying, I can't wait till Christmas. And eventually, in light of the series we're in, I just had to say to him, Justice, sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes life insists that you wait. I didn't say that, nor would I, because that would be silly. But if you weren't with us last week, we did start a series that we're calling Wait. And really what we're exploring is that there's very few things in life that we seek to avoid more than waiting. What I suggested last week is that we loathe waiting. We absolutely can't stand waiting. If at all possible, we will avoid it. Exhibit A, sometime this afternoon, you will be driving along in a relatively small community, and you will still happen upon a traffic signal, and some of you will have the unfortunate thing happen to you that it will move from green to yellow as you approach. The degree to which you hate waiting is measured by what you do with the pedals by your feet. How many of you will use the right pedal? It's 30 seconds. Have you ever thought of that? The average light in Helena, you're saving yourself about 28 seconds. It's worth it. Or I was thinking with regard to our worship gatherings, if we consistently started 10 minutes late, many of you, probably most of you, would almost instinctively adjust what time you showed up. I mean, those of you that like to be here 15 minutes early and get your cup of coffee and sit in the chair and chill out, there's 3 of you that like to get here that early. You would intuitively adjust, and so you would roll in the door at about 10:55. Those of you that you like to be here 5 minutes early, just early enough to get your cup of coffee and not end up in the front row like Raji and Tony. Yes. It's how do I work this into what we're doing here? See, some of you, you like to be here just 5 minutes early. You would just naturally show up at 11:05. Some of you are like Raji and Tony, and we could start at noon, and you just show. Actually, they were surfing this morning, so I'm really throwing them under the bus in non-delightful ways. Or there's this one. Just imagine your behavior when you go to Target. Say on Saturday afternoon, and when you transition from shopping to checking out. Have you ever noticed the chemical changes that happen in your brain as you approach the checkout region of the store? Do you swing wide? Many people, I noticed, as you're coming up on that area of the store, you swing out wide. Why? Because you're going to scan, right? Because right now, you've just shifted from mother, from husband, from parent, from shopper into CIA agent with Google-like analytics that you're going to use to figure out what? How do you check out the fastest? And the shortest line? That's for rookies, right? Like 12-year-olds, they just look for the shortest line and go out that way. No. It's much more complicated than that. So you swing out wide, right? Because you don't want to look pathetic. I don't know about you, but I swing out wide because there's this sense of like, well, I might be looking for clothes for my 6-year-old daughter, or I might be about to check out, right? Because you don't want everyone to know that you're stalking in that area. And then you're scanning, right? You're scanning for all kinds of details, like you're looking at the people standing in line. And of course, you're looking at like how many items are in their cart, but there's more important details even than that, like how many people are in line, more important details like that. You're looking for evidence that they have a 4-year-old with them who's going to hold out for a pack of gum, right? Because that could ruin the whole process. You're looking for any number of different details, and you're also looking, or at least trying to look deep into the eyes of the checker. Are you not? You're asking these very important questions like, do you know the meaning of the word urgency? Like, have you ever been in a hurry in your entire life? Do you want to have a conversation? Because I don't, right? How fast can you move your arm from the left to the right? Because it doesn't look like rocket science, but it's important to me that you can do that with some efficiency. You're looking into their eyes, you're asking questions like, okay, so when the coffee mug that's really $3.99 comes across the radar and there's no UPC code, like, do you have the gumption to ask the customer, how much does it cost? Or will you call for a price check? Like, do you know how to hit 3.99, or does it require another mug with a UPC code actually on it? Are you with me? Like, this is weird things that we do. You're looking for that, or at least I know I am, and you can decide if you are. I'm looking for purple-haired elderly women, no offense if you have purple hair and you're beyond 40, who have a purse. I'm just kidding. Right, but that did not come out the way it was supposed to, but I'm glad you laughed. Right, you're looking for elderly women with a purse. Why? Because inside that purse isn't a Visa card, not a check card, not a $50 bill, but a checkbook, right? And you know that when she gets up there, she just enjoys the conversation. And she'll stand there with her hands in her pockets, and as things are being checked out, eventually the clerk will say, well, that's $23.12. And she'll look surprised, like, oh, like I'm supposed to give you money? Like there's been all this time where they could prepare in advance, right? They don't utilize that time because that's the social hour instead. So then they reach in and they retrieve the checkbook. Some of you are never coming to church here again. But you should try it. It's called Visa. It's an amazing thing. And then they will write their check with penmanship befitting of the Constitution, right? And they'll hand their check over. All this while, like people that got in line after you, they're leaving, and now it's just the principle of the matter, like you're not gonna allow this to happen to yourself. And then, like finally, she is paid. And you know, you're looking for people who will continue to occupy the space. Why? Because they've got a check register. And they're going to record every detail of the transaction before they give up the podium, the magical little 3-inch podium. They're going to hold out, right? You're also watching, maybe this is just me, I swing wide because I know that there's this faint chance that someone's going to start a shift and it's going to sound something like this. I can help you on aisle 13. Like someone might open a new check stand, and this is tricky. Because if you run, you just look pathetic. like nobody likes you, you lose friends. Because you're obligated when you're standing by the person who says that, you're obligated to scan the room and go, right? And then they go, and you, oh, okay. And you take the spot, right? Like there's this obligatory thing that you've got to do. And then for the best of the best of the best, there's one more secret. Because you know at Target, there's not just one row of check stands, right? There's actually 2. And the rookies, they miss it. But you Target veterans, you know that the odds are high that if you scan and you lurk and you don't get sucked into the vortex too quickly, you'll find a check stand where some gentleman is just buying a single stick of deodorant and there will be no line behind him. And you will have the satisfaction of passing 3 or 4 or 5 people and you won't be taking cuts. You'll just be going to an open check stand. Actually, last service, I had a guy come up to me and just prove that I'm not the only pathetic one. He said, Adam, you actually missed one. If customer service is empty, they will check you out. Why do we do this? Because we hate waiting. You just want to say it? Would it feel good to just say, I hate waiting? Just one more time so we sound like a cult. I hate waiting. Yeah. So what we explored last week is this idea of waiting and how much we loathe it, and yet the fact is sometimes life insists that we wait. And sometimes we're not talking about trivial things like the checkout counter at Target. Sometimes we're talking about things like a medical diagnosis. Sometimes we're talking about like hearing back on a job interview. Sometimes we're talking about hearing back from our mortgage company. And like sometimes we're not just playing Barbie, so to speak. We're talking about real serious stuff, real frustrating stuff, real stuff that seems to be outside of our control, and we have to wait, and we don't like it. Maybe you're single, and it's not a disease, and you're healthy, but you'd love to meet the one, you know? Maybe you are looking for a job. I mean, this can translate in so many different ways. And the other thing that we explored last week, which feels appropriate during the Advent season, is not only does life insist that we wait sometimes God does. And sometimes for people who take spiritual things seriously, this can be really, really frustrating and even more confusing. Because sometimes it's really easy to ask the question like, God, you are all powerful, right? Yep, check. So why don't you use your power to make this waiting stop? And I don't know how you answer the question. I'm not enough of a theologian to have a strong answer. Like, is it that God doesn't use his power? Is it that God is somehow limited? I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes not only life, but God himself goes, just wait. I don't know how waiting is relevant for you. I don't know how it's part of your story right now. It seems that two really common ways that it's a part of our story. One, I shared just my own story last week. Sometimes you're capable of doing everything in your power. You've done everything you know to do, whether that's to get into a particular school or save a particular relationship or find a job. You've done everything you know how to do to sell your house. I mean, this could translate in a million different ways, and you hit this wall and you just realize, like, I'm just frankly out of answers. Like it's not a matter of discipline. It's not a matter of self-control. It's a matter of creativity. Like you couldn't name another thing you could do. Sometimes life insists that you wait that way. And sometimes maybe this one's even more prevalent and I think certainly more challenging. Sometimes we hit a point where it's not that we have to wait. We actually have options. One option is we could take things into our own hands. We could manipulate things. We could do things in such a manner that wouldn't at all reflect God, but it would get the job done. This happens when we fill out tax forms. It happens when we talk to employers. It happens in a million different ways. But sometimes we hit this place where it's like, it's not that I have to wait. I could not wait and betray everything that I've set out to be as a person, or I could wait and continue to honor God because I if honoring God is the path I'm taking, I don't even know what the next step would be. And so really what we're doing this morning is, in my mind, embarking on a 3-week journey. Maybe that's far too dramatic, but of just asking the question, why? Why does life sometimes insist that we wait? How do we derive proper value from waiting? I mean, if life is going to insist that you do it sometimes anyway, if God is going to challenge you to do it sometimes anyway, don't you want to redeem it? Which is a churchy word that just simply means you went to the thrift store, you found a shirt that was discarded by somebody who died, and now you're going to wear it to your Christmas party. That's you've taken something that was deemed to have no value and given it great value. That's the gospel. That's what God does with us. That's the way I'm thinking about wait. Is God, how do we redeem this time? Because you're going to make us do it. Sometimes we're not going to have a choice. How do we redeem it? And to really get into this question, there are so many different people's stories in the text that we could utilize, but what we're going to do in this series is just look at Matthew chapter 4 and what is commonly just referred to as his temptations. So if you brought a Bible, I invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 4. If you'd like to follow along on an electronic device, we will not judge you. We will give you the benefit of the doubt, unless we see evidence over your shoulder that you're looking at your fantasy football team, at which point we will chastise you and tell you the Broncos don't play till 2. And also, if you're kind of interested in looking at a Bible app or looking at a Bible on your phone, Lenny's made it so you can go right to YouVersion, which is one of the best online app versions of the Bible out there from our Narrate app. So I digress. Okay, so Matthew chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, which goes to say that, well, that's a understatement, right? Now, I think what's worth noting, if we can just pause at that verse 2, is that in this first century culture of Jesus, this idea of fasting 40 days and 40 nights, particularly for spiritual leaders, is not unique. I mean, you and I, if you say like, hey, who do you know who's fasted for 3 days? You go, nobody, right? And I'm not on that list either, by the way. But in this culture, rabbis who were among the best of the best of the best and were ready to jump into their formal ministry, this was a rite of passage of sorts. That this was one of the things that they would do. It was a demonstration of their faith. It was a demonstration of a lot of things. There's all kinds of rabbinic writing that you can read on that, but this was part of their deal. And I guess my point there is this wasn't hugely foreign, like, whoa, that's not at all the case. Therefore, the story is bigger than just the fasting itself. The tempter came to him and said, if you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Now, if you're a student of the text and you're going, man, this sounds a lot like Genesis 3, it should. That's the way the author's setting it up, that what Eve and Adam failed at, Jesus would succeed at. But nonetheless, the conversation's pretty simple, right? Like, you're God, right? Yep. You're hungry, right? Yep. Your 40 days is over, right? It didn't hit me until this week as I was re-looking at that. Like, technically, if the convention was 40 days, Jesus is in his 41st day. Like, you're done. You've paid your dues. You've done what you're supposed to do. Like, game over. You get to eat now, which really heightens the temptation, I think, because it's like, well, you've done what you were supposed to do, so the next objective is like you get to eat. There was no talk of 41 days. It was 40 days. And yet Jesus' response is telling. He says, it is written, people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. I think to put it succinctly, Jesus waited. And that's the fact of the matter, right? Like, Jesus waited. And I think the question is why? Why did he wait? What value did he see in waiting? What was he communicating? Here's what kind of drew me into this. Like, okay, Jesus, you chose to wait, and we find waiting to be really hard. Why? What were you communicating to yourself by waiting? What were you communicating to God, to your Father, by waiting? What were you communicating to your friends? Because you would eventually tell them the story, so there's some significance there. And ultimately, or not ultimately, but also, what were you communicating to the tempter? What were you saying there? Now, to get inside of that, all of my teaching philosophy would say that I should tell you the big idea, and then we should talk about it, and then I'll tell you again, but I don't want to this morning. Instead, I want to kind of go the way that Jesus went, and there's this idea called a remez. Will you say that word, remez? Some of you have heard it if you've been around here before. It's a Hebrew word that refers to a common institution among rabbinic teachers of this day where they would refer to a single word or a single sentence from, say, a whole psalm. You see Jesus do this from the cross. And the idea is his audience knows that he's referring back to the entire passage, the entire story. With me? We do this all the time. If you're ever guilty of an inside joke, that's what makes an inside joke, right? Like, you were a part of this context where something was said and it was funny and you all laughed out loud, and then you're in a larger group of people and you can just say a couple words like, and then she said, and we all laughed. And everyone else that was there, they know what it is you're talking about. Any Seinfeld fans in the room? I remezed you at the beginning of the service. Did anybody catch it? There's a famous Seinfeld scene that is grossly inappropriate, but I think appropriate enough, where Elaine is sitting on a couch, and Kramer comes walking in, and she says, and he informs them that he has decided to forevermore go commando. You may have to ask somebody else what that means. And she says, you mean all that is between you and me is a thin layer of gabardine? And then she's repulsed. You were unamused. All that lies between you and Christmas Eve is a thin layer of 3 Sundays. Okay, so what Jesus references here is Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy 8 is this much larger story. So what I want you to do in somewhat difficult fashion is set aside the temptation scene in your head and go back to Deuteronomy. Now, the context of Deuteronomy is Moses, of course, with God with Moses, has led Israel out of Egypt. They proved to be immature socially, relationally, spiritually, and so therefore God decided that, hey, this generation is going to wander around for 40 years, and I'm going to teach them stuff, and their kids are going to learn stuff, and when their kids are adults and they're the leaders, they'll be mature enough, and then I'll lead them into Israel, and their parents will be dead, and so this is the way this is going to work. And so in Deuteronomy, what's going on is Moses is looking at this group of people who were, in many cases, not even born when they came out of Egypt, but in some cases were small little children and babies, and he's saying, okay, we're ready to go, but before you go, I got to remind you of something. Because, oh yeah, by the way, those 40 years were supposed to serve a really important purpose. And so what Deuteronomy does is it's Moses kind of going like, guys, here's the big stuff. I mean, here's Vision Weekend. Here's the one thing. Here's the few things we have to hold on to as we move into the Promised Land. That's where Jesus references from. Let's start in verse 2. Remember, Moses says, which is so key, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you. And here's Jesus' reference, to teach you that people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So there's this moment in Israel's history, and probably everyone in this room is familiar with this word manna, but there's this moment where God fed people every morning with manna. See, the question for the Israelites was, how do you eat? Like, if you've been there, there's nothing. In fact, when I was there, I remember asking my guide, like, how long would we make it? Like, if no water, no food, he said you wouldn't live till the end of the day. So these people, they're in the middle of this wilderness. They're entirely dependent. And God says, here's how you're going to eat. Every morning when you wake up, there'll be this bread substance on the ground. Pick it up. That'll get you through the day. Oh yeah, he says. And don't try to pick up 2 days' worth because it'll just rot anyway. In fact, the only time you can pick up more than 1 day's worth is the day before the Sabbath, but that's another story. So every morning, it'll be there. And you say to God, okay, so wait a minute. So we're going to live here for an unforeseen amount of time. And you're telling us that the only way we're going to survive is if you do what you said you would do every morning. Yeah. So you're telling me that I don't have to depend upon you once. I don't put my hand in the air someday at church. You're telling me every day, in a very literal, tangible fashion, we are entirely dependent upon you doing and being who you said you are and would do. That was a terrible sentence, but you're with me, right? Like, you're telling me that we're entirely dependent upon you doing what you said you would do, being who you say you are. Yep. And if you cease to do that, say 10 years from now, we'll die that day. Yep. Satan says to Jesus, hey, you're hungry, right? Yep. You're God, right? Yep. Well, then turn the rocks into bread. Like, what's the big deal? Jesus references, no. There's this story about manna, and I understand that what's really happening right now between you and me has a lot to do with what happened back then between Israel and God. The rest of the Deuteronomy story continues in verse 12. Otherwise, Moses says, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. See, in other words, Moses is saying, I'm concerned that you're going to get into this land and all your needs are going to be met and you're going to forget. You're going to forget that there's more to life than just having your needs met. You're going to forget that trusting God on a daily basis is important. You're going to forget that trusting God's provision, his faithfulness, that being entirely dependent upon it day in and day out is important. It continues, he gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. I'm concerned that you're going to develop this attitude that says, God, I've got it under control. Like, I hope you're there when I die to get me into heaven. I hope you're there if something terrible happens because then I'll depend upon you. But the day-to-day stuff, like, Lord, we got our technology, we got our stuff, we're okay. fascinating, isn't it, that Jesus grabs that story and says, here's the bigger story. Like Satan says to Jesus, here's this deal, and Jesus says, I think I'll wait. What was he communicating to God? I think he was saying to God, God, I trust you. Just such a simple statement, and yet each and every one of you can appreciate how profound it is. Like, God, I trust you. What is he saying to himself? I think he's saying, self, we trust God. That's the way we roll. That's the direction that we chose to go. I think Jesus understood the stakes. I think he understood that at moments like this, when we're challenged to wait, whether that's because we have to or because if we're going to honor God, we must. At moments like this, if we choose not to wait, we're in effect saying, hey, thank you, God, very much for salvation, but I got the details. I think he understood that at moments like this, if we're not careful, God moves from a personal father to a category, from an idea. From this abstract person who's big and out there and he created it and he's in control and he does this great stuff. And so we go to church and we may even read the Bible some and we pray before meals and we still think Jesus is a good guy and we think the Bible is important. But when it comes to the day-to-day stuff like eating and getting a job and finding a spouse and stuff like that, we go, no. God, if I don't, it won't. I think Jesus understood that at moments like this, if he's not careful, God becomes just a distant category who doesn't know his needs, who doesn't have the ability to go like, hey, I want to take care of you every day, who isn't so intimately aware with what's going on and actually wants to know about it. I think Jesus knew that moments like this are catalytic. And that at these moments where God invites us to trust or not trust, that what follows is an invitation to obey or not obey. And if we don't trust and we don't obey, pretty soon we don't believe. Like, do you really know anybody who disconnected from Jesus for intellectual reasons? I mean, granted, they're out there. But I was scanning my brain this week. I can't name one. What I can name are people whom I love, friends, who it went this way. God, I'm not going to trust you here, which means I'm not going to obey you here. And that as a pattern becomes, I don't even believe in you anymore. I think Jesus knew the stakes. And when given the opportunity to wait, went, God, I'm going to pick trust. Now, I don't know how life is demanding that you wait. I don't know whether that deals with, a job, whether it deals with your finances, whether it deals with your relationships, and whether it deals with some business decision. I don't know how he's calling you to wait. Whether you're at this place like where you have to wait because you don't have any other options, or you're at this place where you get to choose between God's path or yours. But what I do think is that it's about more than waiting. It's about more than this particular instance. Like the story is much bigger than that. The story is really, will you continue to trust God on the daily stuff? Or maybe it's an invitation to do it again. Maybe you can remember this time 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 30 years ago when you were in high school or when you were in college or when you first started following Jesus when you were 30-something. Maybe you can remember this time where it was really raw and it was really simple, like just do the next right thing, just do the next right thing. And God now feels really distant and it all just kind of is blurry to you. Maybe this is your invitation to step back into that type of dependence. Maybe God feels really, really far. Well, maybe if you worked backwards, you would realize that he feels far, potentially, because you stopped believing, but you stopped believing because you stopped obeying, and you stopped obeying because you stopped trusting. And that's not like a shameful, like, yeah, you don't trust. It's a God going, hey, trust me. Solomon, the psalmist, said it maybe better than I think it's ever been said. He said this in Proverbs 3. Go ahead. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. I guess my big idea, waiting communicates trust. Sometimes the story is about an opportunity to communicate trust. Maybe for you, you just identify that thing and you just make plans for over the course of the next few weeks. You're going to have these moments with God, and when the anxiety sets in, when the panic sets in, when the worry sets in, when the hope sets in, you take that as an opportunity to go, God, I trust you. Self, we've made a decision to trust God. We've made a decision that we're better off under God than we are any other way. If you're someone here this morning exploring Jesus and what it would look like to follow him, I guess potentially arrogantly, I think this weekend's a perfect weekend because I think that sums up the gospel. That we make a decision, of course, that Jesus was God and that the cross offers forgiveness of sins, yes. But we make a decision that we're going to make this, that we're going to move forward and trust God. And that's really grace. Like, he's trustworthy, and the obedience part is you're taking him at his word, really. Here's my challenge to you. If you're someone exploring Jesus or new to following Jesus, my challenge is to tell somebody. Like, whether that's a kind of a recommitment type deal for you, or whether that's a, like, I've never claimed to follow Jesus before, but I'm claiming to do that now. I think you need to tell somebody. Not so that we can add it to our roles, not so that we can feel good about ourselves, not so we can talk about you behind our back and like pump fists, but because it is such an incredible shift that I think you need someone to help you navigate that.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.